All right, ready? Are you ready to go? Okay. Welcome to Why Not Change the World, the RPI podcast. I'm Rave Hamilton. On this episode, we're talking about reality, particularly of the virtual or augmented variety. I'm joined by Rich Radke, a professor in the Electrical Computer and Systems Engineering Department at Rensselaer.
Hi.
And Jason Hicken, an associate professor in the university's Department of Mechanical, Aerospace, and Nuclear Engineering.
Hello.
Together, they've created the Rensselaer Augmented and Virtual Environment, or RAVE, which is in its first year of operation. Well, why don't you describe it for us?
So the Rave Lab is something we put together. I guess that we had our grand opening at the end of November, and we had been thinking about it and acquiring equipment for it and building it, I think, throughout the course of 2018. And now it's kind of in full operation this semester, spring 2019. And basically, we have a whole bunch of virtual reality rigs, high-end computers, along with high-quality headsets. We've got augmented reality devices like the Microsoft Hololens, and we've got phones and tablets and Oculus Go's and things that are a little bit more portable consumer-grade equipment. And then we've got all the students who are coming in and developing new experiences for it.
I guess we should probably quickly define what's the difference between the two, virtual and augmented reality.
Right. So I'll speak to virtual reality. This is the one where you put on a headset and you completely obscure your view, but then you get that view replaced with this virtual scene. So it's like if you've seen the Ready Player One movie, where you see something completely computer generated. And whereas augmented reality it's more like Tony Stark puts on his Iron Man suit and he gets this additional information, heads-up display given to him. So you see reality, but you also see this additional information given to you.
But that's just about his view, not about his extra superpowers.
That's right. We can't give you that part.
Yeah. That sort of gets to one thing I was wondering if a notion you could disabuse me of perhaps, which is that when I think of virtual reality or even augmented reality, for example, like in the example of Pokemon Go maybe, I mean, I think of games and I think of gaming. And is that what this stuff is good for, or is there more to it than that?
I mean, it's certainly good for that, but we didn't build it so that students could have like the all-night Beat Saber parties, in the rave at night, right? Our goal was to have virtual reality and augmented reality in the service kind of pedagogy, for one thing, like being able to teach concepts better, largely from an engineering point of view. And then also if a faculty member has a research project that would benefit from being visualized or experienced in VR or AR, that's really what we're trying to focus on, is stuff that's a little bit more educational, researchy than just playing games. But I will say that, a lot of the students who get involved in helping us develop for this space do know a little bit about gaming, right? They come from like our GSAS major, for example, and they understand how to put a game together, and that helps in designing these good VR experiences.
Yeah, and I think we want to emphasize that work in VR and AR has been going on for decades. And what's changed, though, with the games, I guess, now and the hardware has driven the price down to a point where we can start asking these questions. Can we use this technology for pedagogy and for different types of research that weren't possible before? So it's really, the price point has come down to this place where these experiences can happen now that weren't possible before. So that's what is really exciting about this right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading about VR since I was in grad school, and you
Right.
read about the cave and so on. It all sounds so cool. And if you're lucky, you go get to visit one. But those at the time were, hundreds of thousands of dollar installations and way, way out of reach of the normal person. And now you can go to, a department store and buy a good VR headset for $300. And if you have a little more spend, maybe a couple $1,000, you can get a pretty high-end system. That was really unthinkable, I would even say, like 5 years ago.
Well, since you mentioned grad school, I mean, what was your own personal journey to developing an interest in virtual reality and wanting to sort of work in this space and make sure that there was a literal space on this university campus for others to explore it?
Well, I guess I'll start. My journey to this place, I guess, started with a National Science Foundation proposal called the Career Proposal. It's a prestigious award that assistant professors are encouraged to apply for and strive to obtain. And a major component of that proposal is to show how you're going to integrate your research with your teaching efforts. and they don't want it to be artificial. They want it to be a real genuine way that you're combining these two things. And so I really spend a lot of time in thinking about, well, what is it that I can do that would marry the aspects of what I do in research. And what I do in research is primarily numerical simulations and optimization. And then I got to thinking tangentially at the same time, there was all this coming out about the Oculus and the HTC Vive. So these VR headsets were coming online. And I started to realize, well, I mean, I could combine these two things by saying have a virtual design environment or a place where students can virtually shape things and learn about various aerodynamic topics. So I realized that this may be a great way for me to combine both my simulation interests and the pedagogy. So I wrote this proposal, and it was successful. And then I started to develop over a couple of summers with help from Professor Ben Chang in Haas in the GSAS department, this great activity we now have for aerodynamics students. And from there, I think various people in the School of Engineering became aware of that effort, including the dean, and I think he started to get interested in expanding this effort and sort of started poking me at the time, I guess, about starting up this space. And I don't remember the exact sequence, but at some point I pointed out that I knew this guy, Rich Radke, and I knew that this guy, Rich Radke, actually had quite a bit of experience with AR, VR, or VR at least. And I didn't mention exactly what that experience was.
I mean, yeah, your background seems much more noble than mine. I mean, I would say that I was probably more of a hobbyist in the sense that I had a couple of VR systems in my lab, and I think that I largely bought them. So my background is in computer vision, and so that means how do you develop algorithms that make sense out of the natural world from pictures and video in the same way that people do. And so one of the great things about being a professor is that you can kind of, pursue whatever interests are really interesting to you. And so for me, one thing I was really interested in was visual effects, and I started to get into that probably maybe 2011, something like that. And so I wrote a book on computer vision applied to the visual effects that you see in TV and movies and so on. And a big aspect of that, for example, is how do you accurately acquire 3D models of spaces, right? So we had a big federally funded project on scanning, buildings on campus with this LiDAR scanner, so we could build very accurate models of buildings. And I had some handheld devices that I had just for my own research, tabletop 3D scanning, and I had green screens and stuff for my class and so on. And 3D acquisition, you start to build models of 3D objects, and I think a natural step was then how could you visualize that stuff in virtual reality, really experience it instead of just looking at spinning on a laptop screen, right? But for me, like I said, it was much more of a hobby, right? I was playing VR games just because I was curious about them at home, and I had a couple of VR systems for my lab. And one thing about lab type work, and one of the reasons why we built the Rave, is that when you're in a research lab, there's not a lot of space to move around, right? You got desks everywhere, you've got 20 years of accumulated books and machines and crap lying around, and so really you can't wave your arms around without hitting anything, right? And so VR offers the opportunity to be able to really physically move throughout a space in kind of human scale, right? Like you could, in theory, walk across a virtual room as long as you had enough space to walk. And so that was one of the reasons why we built the Rave the way we did, is that we wanted to have a large environment where we didn't have tables and desks and chairs in the way, where in theory you could have like a room-sized VR experience where you wouldn't have to suspend the disbelief to have to magically teleport from one place to another. You could really physically cover the ground in the same way as you would if you were in the real world.
Right, because the way you built it is that it is essentially a room.
Yeah, it's just a big empty room with rollable tables and stackable chairs, and
Yeah, I think it's a striking room, but it's surprisingly void of things.
Well, the substance is in whatever's in those headsets.
Exactly.
I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so what? You've both alluded to the idea that there are sort of research projects or activities that students might want to do that benefit from virtual or augmented reality. What are some examples of those?
So I'll talk about the one that I developed for that proposal, which is an aerodynamics related educational activity. And what we're trying to teach students is what are different parameters, or how different parameters on the wing of an aircraft impact a particular type of drag that the aircraft experiences. And when we do this in a classroom setting, usually we'll have maybe a figure, or we'll draw on the chalkboard and we'll describe some equations, and those equations will have these parameters embedded in them. And for some students, that the equation is enough, but for many students, it's not visceral enough. It's not. It doesn't provide this intuition that we would like to give them. So what they get to do in this immersive activity is they put on the goggles, and they're basically in the sky, floating beside an aircraft, and they can walk around the aircraft or float around it. And they have controllers that let them then reach out and change the shape of the wing. So this is just a little prop plane, but as they change the shape of the wing, either making it longer, the span longer, or twisting the wing, they can immediately see the impact that this has on the drag. And so we have an arrow that indicates the amount of drag force on the aircraft, and they see which parameters make that arrow as small as possible. And I think that, again, maybe for some students, they don't need this, but I think for many, it turns these equations that are very abstract into something very real and visceral.
Yeah, it sort of gives them an experience that they can remember rather than a text to memorize, kind of. Is that a fair way of?
Yeah, the way I was thinking about it when I was writing the proposal, and I still think about it this way, is that old adage, teach, or show someone how to fish versus teaching them how to fish or giving them a fish. So if I show someone equations, it's not really going to sink in. If they have to write or drive the equations themselves, that's also very helpful. If you do that and then also have them as designers, as engineers, which is what we're trying to do in our department, then if they get to actually change the shape, that they're doing the design sort of on the fly and seeing the changes, I feel like that's more powerful.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's really kind of, I wouldn't say it's boring, but it doesn't capture, you can't describe virtual reality to somebody. You have to actually try on a headset and fool around with the controllers. As Jason says, it is very visceral to feel like you're in this environment, and also that you can interact with it very naturally. So I could talk about a bunch of projects that are going on in the lab. So one that I just demonstrated to a bunch of industry visitors this morning has to do with, we have this occupancy sensing set up in one of our big office suites in this big center we have, the Lighting Enabled Systems and Application Center. And so that project has to do with how can you use these basically like distance sensing rays. Imagine like the laser measuring tape at the hardware store. The idea is that you have a bunch of these rays pointed outwards from the ceiling, and you're trying to use the way that those rays are interrupted by people as they move around to infer how many people there are in the space. And you could use that, for example, to do better lighting control or better HVAC control. And so we have algorithms for doing that. We have a laptop simulation of it. But one of my students just put together a VR version of that, where you put on the headset and you can teleport down into the kind of human scale version of the space. You feel like you're actually in there. And then you actually see these rays coming down from the ceiling, and you see these avatars walking through them, and you can see how hard it is to avoid being hit by these rays coming down. So it might be that in principle you'd say, it's not possible to solve this problem with only a few of these sparse rays. But then you watch it and you say, I can actually see why this should work, right? So it really does add, even for me, an extra dimension of why this whole research idea should work. So that's one thing. Another thing that I think is kind of cool is that I came to this through kind of a computer vision thing, and there's this topic in computer vision called photogrammetry, which basically means building three-dimensional environments from images alone. And so one of my students took a whole bunch of images of an environment, and then they, probably several hundred, maybe even 1,000 pictures just around the second and third floor of the JEC building, and then they use some off-the-shelf tools to synthesize a 3D model where you put on the helmet and you feel like you're walking around on the third floor. And then you can kind of, if you go to the top of the stairwell, you kind of instantaneously zip down to the second floor where the statue and the courtyard are. And, the texture of the environment is not as good as a photograph, but you really do feel like a real sense of presence, especially if you're familiar with the space. And I think that goes back to what Jason was saying earlier about how, it's not necessarily about being 100% physically accurate in terms of texture or physics or anything like that, but your mind is willing to believe that you're in this space, and you're willing to overlook the not quite real nature of it because it does feel very compelling.
The one place where that is not true is which we haven't had a problem yet with, but is where there's motion.
Oh, yes. So I gotta tell you that. So one of my other students, I gave her the job of basically taking this spherical camera that you press a single button. It's called the Ricoh Theta. It's a really neat little gadget, and it acquires an instant spherical 360-degree image of wherever you are, and it also takes video, right? So you can click this button. You can just put that right onto this virtual headset, and then you can feel like you're in this environment. And I take it on vacation, and it's really nice to be able to revisit places I've been in the headset. It's a different experience than a photograph. So she gave this to a hockey player, and he skated around the RPI rink with this thing in his hand, and it's really weird to watch because there are a lot of VR experiences that are similar to like literally roller coaster experiences where they put the camera in the seat of a roller coaster, and because you're not moving from your chair, it feels okay. Like you feel like you're in a roller coaster, and it's kind of fun. But the hockey thing is much different because the hockey player is moving and he's weaving from side to side, and you're standing still and looking around, and maybe you're not looking where he's looking, and that disconnect can be very disconcerting. And so that's one thing that if you look at VR experiences, a lot of times they are more stationary, or they give the user all the agency to move around, but they're not like, you're replaying a movie that is from someone else's point of view.
Right. If we want to scale this up and use this more broadly for engineering and science education, we need to be worried about this sort of thing. But I think the good thing about the kind of applications we're thinking about for pedagogy is that this probably won't be as big of a deal because as I described with that airplane example, the student is walking around the airplane, so they are actually feeling the motion. Actually, for me, the roller coaster even was sort of sickness-inducing. So when I tried the hockey, the ice hockey exam, it was really hard. It was like a 30-second experience for me, and I had to take off the headset.
So that's there might be some people for whom this version of reality is just not the one that they choose to participate in. Is that fair enough? So I imagine there's some extent to which there will be students who don't want to engage in this sort of learning.
Honestly, we've while I know that it's true that some people have like a real visceral aversion to VR sometimes, we've probably shown the lab to hundreds of people by now, and no one has had to leave the lab because their head is spinning. I mean, I agree that maybe that type of learning is not for everybody. Hopefully, most people can physically stand it.
Yeah, I guess you might have to anticipate, like in a population of 1,000, you're going to have maybe one or two students that for which you, just like with any accessibility issue, you'd have to anticipate and have some backups idea. It might be enough for them to just experience it on a desktop, maybe. Yeah,
and I do want to say that we've focused really so far almost exclusively on virtual, but I think that augmented is very different, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So augmented reality,
more stationary to some extent, perhaps.
Not necessarily stationary, but more like you're in the real world, right? So
you've got an anchor.
Yes. So you're looking at the scene and you are seeing stuff that is superimposed in it, right? And so. One example is, Ravi Shankar Sundararaman. I think I got that name right on the first try. So he's in our material science department, right? And he's developed this thing where you look at a little pattern cube on a table and you look at it through your tablet, just like an off-the-shelf tablet, or you could use your phone or your iPad or whatever. And so when you hold it in front of the tablet, you see this, molecular structure superimposed on the cube, right? And so you're in full control of turning it to see how it changes as you move it around, and you can move the tablet around, and you're not blocked off from reality, right? You're kind of like augmenting it by looking through a window into this next generation thing. And also the same thing is true with we have an example with a Microsoft HoloLens, which is a device that you put on your head. The first generation is still, working the kinks out in terms of it's not 100% comfortable, but it's not as weird as putting on a VR headset. And then you have your both hands free to be able to do things like manipulate one student has developed this thing where it's a CNC milling machine, which has all sorts of crazy buttons on it that are really hard to interpret. And so when you put this thing on, you see the machine, but then you see these kind of superimpose transparent graphics on the surface of the machine that says, okay, if you feel like you're in danger, press this button. And if you want to set the, width of this tool, you turn this knob. And so that stuff kind of appears as these floaty instructions in the real world. And I don't think anyone would really find that off-putting. I mean, I think that's probably, very acceptable for everybody.
Yeah, that's a much easier experience, I would say.
Yeah.
So you did mention that it's sort of in its early stages and there's still kinks to be worked out. I mean, obviously just the Rave itself is only a few months old at the time we're recording this. Where do you see this going? Or, I guess both the physical space that we have here at the Rensselaer campus and just this use of VR and AR and pedagogy in general.
Well, one of the reasons why the space exists is precisely to figure out where is this going. It's not really an end in itself. The space is really about trying things out, both for teaching and pedagogy and for research. And it's hard to really predict where it's going to go. I'd like to see potentially some courses where there are subjects where they're either too expensive or too dangerous to do labs for. For example, chemical engineering might want to do a chemical plant emergency shutdown, and they could do that in virtual reality. But we have to try it out. There's things that we need to figure out, like does this scale to 50 student classrooms? Does this actually produce better student learning outcomes? And we're not coming into this, completely sold on everything. We just think that it's very worthwhile looking at.
Yeah. I mean, really what I'm hoping is, up to this point, a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the lab has been work of my students and Jason's students. And, the goal of it is that it's not just our place, right? We want to hook up interested students with faculty members and people who have interesting problems or interesting pedagogical ideas, and then just have a space where people can develop that stuff without, with all the tools there, without bumping into things, right? And so that's already starting to happen in terms of finding people on campus who are, excited about, oh, I've got this idea, can I prototype it in your lab? And we say, sure, right? And that's something where it would be nice where we pass by the lab and it's bustling with students who are developing their own projects. And I think that's starting to happen. I mean, certainly now there are a whole bunch of people that I'm passing by and I say, oh, there's someone in the lab. What are they doing? It's not something that I put there. So, and that's nice. That's a nice feeling.
Well, and I mean, speaking of bringing in other people and also specifically with you guys having formed this thing, at Rensselaer, we have this idea that sort of drives the university called the New Polytechnic, which is all about breaking down barriers and fostering collaboration. So as collaborators yourselves, I was just wondering if you had lessons learned or thoughts on what makes for a good collaboration from this project so far.
Well, in this case, I'm pretty fortunate because Rich is pretty like-minded in many respects, so I haven't had a whole lot of issues with, completely orthogonal thoughts. I don't know.
Well, I mean, certainly, even before we built the lab, right, we had to make a ton of decisions about what equipment are we going to buy and physically what are we going to need in the space, right, in terms of how we set the whole place up. And so that was, months and months of figuring stuff out. And, that was just like kind of the two of us collaborating, right? Along with all the physical facilities people who helped us out to build the place, right, and to procure the stuff. Hopefully we built the space to hold, 15, 20 people at a time doing a whole bunch of different things, right? And so I'm, for example, really excited to take my class there next semester to do a few, 3D acquisition and, then see it right in VR immediately activities, right? And to see how people kind of bounce off each other and say, oh, this is a cool thing. Let me try that. Let me adopt this idea. And even just today, giving the tour to some people who had never seen the space before, I came away with some ideas about stuff for my own research and teaching that I wouldn't have had if we hadn't had a whole bunch of people in the same room kind of experiencing it for the first time. So,
yeah, one of the things about building the space has been that it has exposed me to a lot of people, a lot of their work, and their interest in using the space and the things that they think that they could do with it. So I've had a great experience collaborating with Rich, and I expect I'm going to have a great experience with many other people because they're coming out of the woodwork, so to speak.
Yes, that's right.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you for coming out of the woodwork and joining us today.
No problem.
No problem.
Why Not Change the World is recorded in the Soloist Suite at MPAC, the Curtis R. Preem Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Thank you to the MPAC staff for their assistance, and thank you for listening.